Japan wants to counter Russia and China and become a great power again. And this is despite the fact that almost 30% of Japan's population is over 65 years old. It has a public debt close to 250% of GDP and economic growth that, according to the International Monetary Fund, will slow to 0.8% in 2026. In fact, Tokyo is trying to transform its economy into a geopolitical tool, which means that defense, energy, technology, and finance are all becoming part of the same new national strategy. For Tokyo, this behavior is crucial as it prepares for a world with a more aggressive China, a more vulnerable Taiwan, and greater Russia-Beijing cooperation. Not to mention the fact that Americans are becoming less and less reliable, and it's not certain that they would actually defend Taiwan or Japan in the event of a conflict. Japan is one of the largest economies in the world, and in 2025 it had a GDP of over $4.4 trillion. At the same time, however, it faces structural problems related to demographics, public debt, and productivity. Just think that in 2024 people over 65 made up 29.8% of the Japanese population, while those under 15 were only 11.4%. And this tells us that Japan faces a problem with pensions, healthcare sustainability, and above all, a possible decline in future productivity. Fewer young people means fewer innovative, productive individuals. Oxy noted Japan must boost productivity and worker numbers to offset its population decline. And then there's the public debt, which in 2025 was close to 250% of GDP. In addition, the International Monetary Fund explained that in 2026, Japan could still have a deficit, meaning it could spend more money than it takes in, and that as the years go by, the debt could continue to weigh more and more compared to the country's GDP, especially from 2035 onwards, because the state will have to spend more on debt interest, healthcare, and assistance for the elderly. Now, this doesn't mean that Japan is close to collapse. Also because a good part of Japan's debt is held by the Japanese themselves, plus the country is a major financial power. But it does tell us that Tokyo has less room to maneuver compared to younger and less indebted countries. And this is because while Japan has to spend the money it gets from taxes to pay interest on its debt and the ever-increasing number of pensions, other countries can invest to increase the productivity of their own economies. However, Japan's fragility shouldn't be seen as irrelevant. On the contrary, Japan matters a lot. And its possible weakening is a problem that doesn't concern only the Japanese but also global industry and finance, and the geopolitical balance in Asia. Just think about the Japanese automotive industry, its technology, and its geographical position facing China, Korea, Taiwan, and Eastern Russia. We're talking about a country that is located in one of the most important points of global power. That's why it's important for it to develop a strategy to reverse the decline, which is what it's doing. However, it's not simple. The global situation, which is driving up inflation and forcing central banks to raise interest rates, is also a factor. This further slows down the economy. In fact, even though for decades Japan was the symbol of low interest rates to stimulate economic growth, in the last 2 years the trend has changed, and in June 2026 the Bank of Japan raised rates to 1%, the highest level in the last 31 years. The fact is that the Bank of Japan explained that the Japanese economy is holding up fairly well, but keeping interest rates too low would be risky. Because with inflation close to 2% and a weak currency, Japan risked having even more price increases, especially for energy. So it raised interest rates, even though this could slow down the economy. Now pay attention, for Japan a weak currency is a serious problem, and if interest rates remain low, the yen risks falling too much. If it falls, it becomes costlier for Japan to buy energy and raw materials abroad, impacting families and businesses in this import-heavy country. But on the other hand, if interest rates rise too much, the economy slows down and the debt becomes heavier, and this is exactly one of Japan's problems. It must avoid a currency that's too weak and tightening that's too strong. It's no coincidence that the finance minister said the government is ready to intervene, while the yen has reached 161.8 per dollar, close to the weakest levels in recent decades. However, it should also be said that a weak yen can help exports because it makes Japanese products more affordable abroad, so it can help some companies. But at the same time, as we've already said, it can affect the cost of living. And in fact, also to help citizens' purchasing power. The Japanese government is considering cutting the consumption tax on food from the current 8% to 1% for 2 years. This would be the first real reduction of this kind in the country's history. The point, however, is that this measure would result in a loss of about 4 trillion yen in public revenue, which is around 24 billion euros compared to a GDP growth of just 0.3 trillion yen or less than 2 billion euros. So the government can try to help families, but this also increases the pressure on public finances, which are already very fragile. And this is Japan's trap. If it tries to protect growth, it risks worsening its finances. If it tries to protect its finances, it risks worsening growth. At this point, however, we need to change perspective. perspective, because Japan can no longer afford to think of itself as just a trading power, since the world has now become too unstable to separate the economy from security. In fact, if in the old world Japan could be an industrial giant protected by the American umbrella and focused on producing cars and technology, in the new world instead, a country that doesn't control energy, semiconductors, and defense risks becoming too dependent on countries that may not be such good friends. And this is where economics, geopolitics, and finance intertwine. According to Reuters, the Japanese government is preparing a plan of about 370 trillion yen, roughly $2.3 trillion in public and private investments by 2040 across 17 strategic sectors, including artificial intelligence, chips, and space. But within this discussion, the topic of crypto is also interesting because Reuters tells us that Japan is considering new rules to define crypto as financial products and to reduce the taxation on profits, which today can reach up to 55% down to 20%. So Tokyo is trying to make itself more attractive for financial innovation capital as well. But what is the biggest vulnerability for Japan? It's probably Taiwan, because Taiwan is the point where military security, international trade, and semiconductors meet. So a crisis on the island wouldn't be a distant problem for Tokyo, but a direct threat to its own industry and its own maritime routes. Also because Taiwan, besides being an island disputed between Beijing and Washington, is also one of the world's major tech hubs, especially for the production of the most advanced chips. And chips are needed to produce cars, servers, and even military systems. So if Taiwan were to be blocked, attacked, or destabilized, the problem would directly affect Japanese factories and global value chains, especially those of the entire West. That's why Japan is now trying to get back into the semiconductor supply chain. And Reuters has already reported that TSMC wants to produce advanced chips in southern Japan, with an investment that the Japanese press says is about $17 billion. This is industrial news, of course, but it's also geopolitical news because it means moving part of the strategic production out of Taiwan and into another country allied with the United States. And at the same time, the Japanese government is also supporting Rapidus, which is the national project to produce advanced semiconductors. And this is also connected to artificial intelligence, because the Bank of Japan has indicated that global demand related to artificial intelligence is already supporting corporate profits and investments by Japanese companies. But what about energy? Japan imports about 95% of its oil from the Middle East, and about 70% of that oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz. This tells us that a crisis in Iran or along the Gulf routes can become a Japanese problem, even though Japan is geographically far away. Of course, the country has significant emergency reserves, so it's not unprotected in the short term, but structural dependence is high, and it makes Tokyo sensitive to any tension along the energy routes. The Bank of Japan said rising oil prices from the Middle East may lower company profits and reduce Japanese families' purchasing power. And at this point, it becomes clear why Japan looks at China and Russia with such concern, because for Tokyo, these two powers pose strategic pressure. China is the main challenge, using industry, technology, and military power to shift Asia's balance. And according to the Japanese defense minister, Beijing is rapidly increasing its military capabilities, intensifying activities in the East China Sea, and increasing pressure around Taiwan. The Japanese document I referenced describes China as the greatest and unprecedented strategic challenge for Japan. And it also highlights Chinese activities around the Senkaku Islands, exercises near Taiwan, and actions in the South China Sea, which for Tokyo are linked to the peace of the Indo-Pacific. Russia poses a different threat than China. Lacking China's economic power, it still maintains military relevance and operates in the region, especially the Northern Pacific. The most worrying point, however, is that Russia and China are also getting closer in their military activities near Japan, and the Japanese Ministry of Defense reports joint bomber flights and joint naval operations near the country, describing them as a show of force against Tokyo. So Japan cannot look at China and Russia as separate problems, because Beijing and Moscow, even though they have different interests, can coordinate to increase pressure on Japan's strategic space. And in fact, Tokyo is increasing military spending and has approved a defense budget for the 2026 fiscal year of over 9 trillion yen, which is about $58 billion, with a 9.4% increase compared to 2025. This increase is part of a program that should bring Japanese military spending to 2% of GDP. But the really important thing is the change in mentality, because after World War II, Japan built its identity around a very limited use of military force, while today it is strengthening counterattack capabilities, long-range missiles, and the defense of its own islands. Consider that the new budget includes more than 970 billion yen, which is more than 5 billion euros to strengthen missile and standoff capabilities, and 177 billion yen, which is about 1 billion euros, to purchase missiles with a range of about 1,000 kilometers. This means that Japan wants to make it more difficult for any hostile power to create a crisis around its islands, in Taiwan, or along the Indo-Pacific routes. And this is the point that China and Russia need to consider. Japan may seem like an aging power, but it is building a concrete response to the new global instability. However, Japan's geopolitical comeback will not be a return to the Japan of the 1980s. It won't regain its former economic dominance or surpass the United States, but it can be vital for technological supply chains and help build a network of industrial democracies resilient to authoritarian pressures. However, without deluding ourselves that Washington will be there forever. In fact, the Japanese Ministry of Defense does define the alliance with the United States as a pillar of national security. But at the same time, it also insists on cooperation with other countries that share similar interests. Japan is also strengthening ties with the United Kingdom, Italy, and Indo-Pacific partners. For example, Japan plans to spend more than 160 billion yen, which is about 900 million euros, to develop a next-generation fighter jet together with the United Kingdom and Italy, with the goal of deploying it in 2035. Do you think Japan can contain China and Russia and regain great power status? Let me know in the comments.